Again, my name is William Huggins. I teach a number of different courses in the MBA and the BL MBA programs. So if you're in either of these programs, you will certainly end up encountering me at some point. I teach the introductory economics and statistics course for both MBA and the blended learning. I also teach introductory corporate finance in both of these programs. And as Jen mentioned, I also teach an elective for the MBA program and BL on the history of finance. So this morning, I was asked to give you a short 20-minute talk on something interesting that would provide some insights and generate a little bit of engagement and perhaps some excitement about going back to school. And to give you a little bit of an idea about the sort of high-level thinking that we try to engage in when we're engaged in graduate work. So today I wanted to get on to a particular topic that I thought would be interesting to a large number of people and would be something that would be relatively straightforward for people to engage with. This is not a topic that really requires a lot of specialized knowledge already. This is the sort of thing that any participant within society is equipped to have an opinion about. And this, of course, is the social role of corporations. Now, to give a basic example of what it is that we're talking about, just to make sure everybody's on the same page, when we talk about a corporation ultimately comes from a Latin word, corporare, which means to combine into one body. So really what a corporation is a collective association that's designed to improve the allocation of resources. Generally speaking, corporations exist, at least in theory, to reduce the costs associated with a pure market allocation system. Back in the 30s, economist Ronald Coast wrote actually a paper looking at why it is that corporations exist. And a lot of people thought that it was pretty simple, quite frankly. They had made the argument that corporations had been around for hundreds of years, and asking why they existed was simply an obvious question. But it turns out that Coast's research revealed some pretty useful insights for us. If we consider how hard it would be to organize, say, 500 factory workers without someone who's been given the authority to allocate resources by fiat rather than negotiation, then you can imagine how long it would take to even design an automobile, let alone put one together. So usually what we are talking about when we're talking about a corporation is a large group of people that has gotten together. Strictly speaking, individuals can start sole proprietorships or individual corporations, but usually the issues that we're concerned with when we talk about the social role of companies are what happens when we have larger entities. So before we get into this, I want to identify very quickly that we do have an important distinction between two different kinds of corporations, which we very frequently encounter in society. And these are not-for-profit corporations like hospitals, municipalities, churches, etc., and for-profit entities like things like Tim Hortons or the Ford Motor Company that you are a little bit more familiar with. Companies that might be looking to sell you a particular good or service because their goal is ultimately to generate some kind of economic profit, some kind of profit above and beyond what's minimally required to compensate them for the risks and the investments that they have to make. So today what we're going to be focused on are largely the behaviors of for-profit companies. But I wanted to be clear at the beginning that most corporations do have a social role simply by virtue of the fact that they are entities created within society to serve some kind of social purpose, like the McMaster Children's Hospital or even the community of Hamilton. Now, let's take a look at the very basics of for-profit business to get a good handle on how we got to where we are today. When we're looking at for-profit businesses, generally speaking, we're trying to understand what the value proposition is and why it is that society benefits from any kind of entrepreneurial activity. And the easy solution is that enterprise ultimately creates value for society, whether we're dealing with farmers or craftsmen or really any kind of entrepreneur, by identifying some kind of unmet need or unmet desire in society. Now, of course, this is fairly straightforward when we're talking about individual farmers or individual craftsmen. On the other hand, it's another story when we start talking about large-scale organizations. Because when we're dealing with what we call a sole proprietorship, right, the traditional blacksmiths or fishermen that might support a community, or as far back as, say, the Bronze Age, we really have to recognize that there's an important difference between them and modern behemoths like Tim Hortons or Ford. The major difference, of course, is that these small entrepreneurs, these sole proprietors, are producers who are members of a community in which their stuff gets used. And this is fairly important because the blacksmith who makes sub-quality product is going to be visited by his customers later the same day. The fisherman who sells bad product is going to be visited by the people who he sold this product to. And so that usually means when we're talking about small businesses and sole proprietorships, but the sense of affiliation between the buyers and sellers is relatively strong. This reduces likelihoods for conflicts. It improves our ability to make things right in case a problem arises with a business. So there are a lot of advantages to this. The problem is, of course, that a lot of our modern enterprises could never possibly be conducted by an individual. In fact, going back thousands of years, we very quickly encountered things like irrigation works, the construction of aqueducts or road systems that necessarily required the involvement of many, many people. And as a result, these kinds of collective ventures also provided benefits to society by providing an unmet need or desire, but they created a distance necessarily between the people who were providing the services or goods and the people who were ultimately consuming them. Now, in the largest organizations, it's almost impossible today for anyone to have a clear understanding of every single process. And this, to our benefit, contributes to the development of systems historically like audit and reporting. It was very easy when a blacksmith running their own shop understood exactly who their suppliers, who their customers were, and how to conduct the business in the best interests of their community. But once we have thousands of people or hundreds of people working together on a single operation, their individual behaviors are often divorced from the larger objective that they're hoping to accomplish. Now, one of the reasons that we're more concerned about scaled organizations is because large organizations have outsized impacts on the communities in which they conduct their affairs. These can be positive opportunities where we create a lot of employment and we can generate a lot of surplus in a community and help lift people out of poverty. But at the same time, it can also be the result of corporations, you might say, behaving badly, as we saw with the Union Carbide Company in Bhopal in 1984, where we have corporations simply neglecting the interests of local communities and people being harmed as a direct result. So I want to quickly talk about a particular example here about the benefits of scale operations. Down here on the bottom right-hand side of the slide, you'll see an artist's rendition of the mills from the Garonne River in southern France. And this sort of operation began very simply by a small number of people who had identified that there was a particular turn in the Garonne River where the water sped up. And when you've got a turn in the river where the water speeds up, this creates an opportunity for them to create water mills, which are particularly profitable. So at first, a small number of entrepreneurs decided that they wanted to create mills along the river. And this seemed fine, but what they had to do in order to secure this was to rent the rights from the local sovereign for them to be able to set up this operation. And this meant that they made a formal exchange. They paid the local sovereign every year for the right to maintain their businesses at a particularly geographical location, which made it particularly profitable. So this system originally got started in 1138 with just 4 partners who put together some capital and thought that they should try to build mills at this site. By 1327, there were 12 separate companies operating at this site, and they decide to merge all of their operations together to create a firm called L'Honneur d'Albazacle in southern France. Now, this company grew to be rather substantial in size and attracted a lot of investors. Shares were transferable in this company. Over the centuries, the shares were held by the operators of the mill themselves, their heirs, local lawyers, members of city governments, bankers, religious institutions, and even the employees, strictly speaking. Advantageously, because we were dealing with such a large organization, this firm was able to create a number of valuable governance techniques, which we still use today to try to coordinate the efforts of large numbers of people participating within their community. We saw that the L'Honneur d'Albazacle laid out a formal charter describing the rights of all of the investors. They built up an oversight committee to ensure that management was going to be operating the company in the best interests of all of the local investors. They had annual shareholder meetings in which everyone was invited to participate, and they made provisions to report and distribute profits to everyone. Interestingly enough, while the large northwestern European trading companies often end up with point of pride of being some of the oldest or longest lived corporations, Lenard del Bazakla was in operation for over 800 years. And it wasn't until 1945 that it was finally nationalized by the French government. And if you visit the site today, they made a hydro dam on that location. But what's important about this is that as the organization became larger and larger, there became a need for us to develop tools to try to control its behavior, to ensure that the people who were allocating resources on behalf of a collective of hundreds of investors and hundreds of workers were going to do so in a way that made all the people better off. Now, during the period of English monopolies, if we move up to Northwestern Europe, so in the period from about the 12th to 18th century, we notice that similar kinds of economic privileges, the monopoly rights to use certain kinds of features or to conduct certain sorts of businesses, were often acquired by investors in exchange for support of the state during various times of crises. That often meant that despite having access to a particular monopoly trade, that the owners of firms were usually expected to supply ships, men, information, money, or whatever it is that the state might happen to need in a moment of crisis to ensure its own survival. So, for instance, during the 100 Years' War, the Company of Merchants of the Staple of London received a monopoly on all British woolen exports for well over 100 years. Likewise, in exchange for monetary support during the 9 Years' War, the Bank of England gained exclusive right to the government's banking business and a monopoly on all banking functions within 25 miles of the City of London. Another example is the Hostmen of Tyne. They maintained monopoly rights to move coal from the shore of the Tyne River to loading ships out on the river proper, which enabled them to capture enormous profits for decades at the expenses of British households all over the countryside, who paid enormous markups simply to the people who were moving the coal from the side of the river out to the larger ships in the center of the river that would be able to bring it out to sea. Now, interestingly enough, many of these early monopolists recognized the privileges that had been bestowed upon them, and some of them even engaged in significant philanthropy with their newfound riches. The most famous example of this is Sir Thomas Smythe, whose charities still exist today. He was the director of 8 different British trading companies during the 7th century and insisted on being paid a salary of £1 for the entire year in all of the years that he served. It's worth noting, of course, that he was able to trade on his own account from some of the companies that he was operating and was thereby in a position to enrich himself. But he felt ultimately that society needed to benefit from the profits that were being accrued by the monopolists. And so the Thomas Smythe's charities were designed to help redistribute some of these profits. And we see this same sort of attitude in the 19th century among industrialists turned philanthropists in the United States, whether we're looking at John Rockefeller or we're looking at the founders of US Steel like Andrew Carnegie. We see that their names are on libraries and concert halls and schools all over the United States. These billionaires having literally taken the profits from their particular enterprises and distributed enormous sums back to society. In fact, if we take a look at Andrew Carnegie, he's famous for remarking that the man who dies rich dies disgraced. He very much felt that people should attempt to learn what they could in the first third of their lives, the second third of their lives to earn as much money as possible, but in the last third of their lives to redistribute those funds to society at large. Now, while corporations tended to act a little bit more reasonably when they were under the eyes of authorities of investors, major problems begin to emerge historically when firms start to operate beyond the horizon. So give you a couple of examples of this. In the first decade of their operations, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, made more money acting as pirates than they did from conducting any sort of trade, a type of business many of the Dutch shareholders were not particularly fond of once they learned what was happening. The VOC also engaged in wholesale genocide. They depopulated the Banda Islands in modern-day Indonesia, replacing all of the local inhabitants with slaves because they felt that slaves would not try to be able to run away, having nowhere to go go compared to simply enslaving the locals. Needless to say, many of the shareholders at the time did not very much approve of many of these warlike behaviors. And even though there was some agreement among the people controlling the firm, many of the public shareholders of the VOC at the time were much more pious in nature and felt that there was significant problems with their trading company effectively acting as an armed extension of the state. Another one that's perhaps a little bit closer to home is the Hudson Bay Company. The Hudson Bay Company had been granted a monopoly over all commerce in the entire Hudson Bay watershed. It's worth noting, historically speaking, that the English Crown did not actually control this territory in any way when they handed it over to the shareholders of the Hudson Bay Company. So rather unusually, these investors were able to exploit an ill-gotten monopoly for a couple of hundred years before the forced surrender of territory to Canada proceeded in the 19th century. But during the period of its monopoly, the Hudson Bay Company literally blocked all trade that it did not directly control. It robbed and imprisoned settlers who it accused of violating its own laws, had its own stockades, its own courts, and in many cases shot to kill trespassers from competing companies who attempted to encroach on their lands. It's a very different history of the Hudson Bay Company than what we've been used to reading about over the last 150 years, but learning about the Hudson Bay Company's activities from 1670 through the early 1800s may be enough to turn the stomachs of many people who were not the London investors. Finally, to really top things off, we can consider the horrors of transportation and plantation slavery that were similarly invisible to the eyes of British investors. They basically enjoyed a steady stream of profits that was enabled by incalculable suffering. It's a lot harder to happily enjoy the profits of plantation bonds when you are visually confronted with the way that people had to live, that the way that people endured centuries of slavery in order to produce profits for faraway investors. Remember that at the time, in the 1700s, there was a popular narrative that the people who had been enslaved in the Caribbean and America preferred it to the wildness of their freedom in Africa, because this gave them the opportunity to become Christians and to work hard, as opposed to living in godless leisure, as the British were so apt to describe it. So needless to say, there is a significant problem with what starts to happen when individual investors cannot reasonably supervise the companies that they've invested in. In those types of situations, it's very easy for corporations to effectively run off the tracks. Now, with the collapse of the English monopoly system, and finally the introduction of income taxes, companies began to assert that society granted them very few privileges in exchange for their contributions. In fact, some corporations even went as far as to trade with wartime enemies, like in the case of the Union Banking Corporation that continued to provide services for the Nazis for the first 2-3 years that the Americans were actually at war with the German Empire. So interestingly enough, this has created a modern problem for us, an interesting sort of situation. Ultimately, corporations today have largely dissociated themselves from social and political accountability and have tried to cast themselves as more private and economically focused organizations. Nonetheless, many of them remain very active in trying to shape regulations that apply to their business, applying political pressure, making donations to ensure favorable outcomes. So as much as corporations like to say that they are purely profit-focused, it's also important to note that they work hard to shape society to encourage laws which are more profitable for them. Now, although many laws delineate minimum obligations for corporations, a lot of citizens in the modern world wonder whether or not firms ought to be more engaged with their society in some way, through perhaps some form of corporate responsibility that goes beyond simply not breaking the law. And this raises interesting questions for us, such as what exactly does society provide for corporations in the modern world? And perhaps interestingly enough, what do corporations provide for society? So to address this question, we've got a couple of things for us to think about. First off, what is it that society provides to modern corporations? Well, it's worth noting that modern corporations enjoy protection of their domestic assets and a legal system to resolve their disputes. This is particularly important for anyone who's trying to make long-term investments and hoping to be able to harvest any sort of economic surplus in the long run. Without a dispute resolution system, it can be impossible for a firm to engage in any kind of coordinated activity. And without any kind of protection for their domestic assets, firms would be loath to invest in anything that can't necessarily be snuck away before some sort of rapacious members of society happen to simply wander across them. Now, it can be easily argued that these two things are provided for in exchange for taxes, but there are two other interesting things which corporations benefit from in the modern world, which it's not clear that they are paying for with the very minimum taxes that they pay and their efforts to perform what is minimally required of them from a legal perspective. And this is the tax deductibility of interest and, perhaps most importantly, limited liability. Limited liability is a legally established provision which allows investors to only lose the amount of capital which they have necessarily provided. Now, of course, this has created all kinds of interesting problems because it has allowed a shield for investors to protect themselves to some extent from potential corporate malfeasance. For instance, an investor who backed a firm that was engaged in unethical behaviors might very well enjoy the profits of these unethical behaviors until they are discovered by some authorities who may then take action. When the authorities take action against the corporation, the investor is only in a position to lose as much as they still have invested that is within the corporate balance sheet. Simply put, if the shareholders have effectively managed to loot all of the profits and left very little behind, then when the company finally is caught up with by the authorities, as it turns out, most of the gains will have already been apportioned to investors, and limited liability prevents the state from reaching into the pockets of those investors who profited from this behavior to withdraw this. Now, the reason we created limited liability provisions in general, usually starting around from a legal perspective in the early 19th century. We see it in 1811 as in New York State extends a limited liability to all manufacturing firms, for instance, and the British followed by it 1825, I believe. What we see is that limited liability was important to attracting early investors. For instance, if my grandmother decided to invest as a silent partner in a factory operation, she didn't have necessarily the insider knowledge of what was going on in the factory, whether corners are being cut, whether employees are being exposed to danger, whether bad or poor quality products are being sold to customers. And as a result, the notion was that she should not bear full responsibility for choices that are made by other allocators within the organization who do understand the dangers they're exposing people to. So limited liability was supposed to be set up in order to attract effectively silent investors, the people who did not have direct decision-making control over the firm. But this has also created a shield behind which people can engage in behavior that is effectively deniable, arguing that they didn't control the firm, that they didn't know terrible things were being done in their name, even while enjoying the same profits the entire time. So there are real concerns about the provision of limited liability. And similarly, people have questioned whether or not interest ought to remain tax deductible for corporations, as it is effectively a subsidy from taxpayers onto investors. And so there are two large things that society still does provide in excess for businesses. And that raises a question of what are we getting for it? Are the products and services that businesses create and the taxes they remit to society enough? Should we have any further expectations of them? While most people are willing to concede that firms' capacity to improve resource allocation is valuable to society, it's not really clear what sorts of expectations or constraints on their behaviors ought to be applied. So to reframe the question a little bit closer, do corporations have any sort of social obligations beyond their bare legal requirements? And so there are some interesting positions that people have advanced related to this as to whether or not firms should be pursuing simply a particular goal or whether they should have a variety of goals. In general, because companies are so large, what first problem we run into is the challenge of establishing consensus over what a corporate objectives ought to be. Economist Milton Friedman suggested that profit is enough. Effectively, let the owners sort it out. That if we simply focus on generating enough profit and remitting this profit to the owners can then decide for themselves how it is that they'd like to make social use of their profits, as opposed to necessarily leaving that decision in the hands of a manager. But this isn't the only perspective. For instance, the Henry Ford perspective from the early 20th century was that he wanted his workers to be well paid enough to buy the factory output that they were creating. Now, this is obviously in contradiction to the notion that firms should necessarily maximize profits, because paying workers high wages is not the same thing as maximizing profits for the owners of the firm. And to take it one step further, if we move to the late 20th century, we have banking pioneer Muhammad Yunus from Bangladesh, who points out that access to credit, in his opinion, is a fundamental right. He established Grameen Bank, which was designed to make microfinance loans to some of the world's poorest, arguing effectively that the firm had a social role that it wanted to fulfill because for-profit ventures had neglected important aspects of society that was undermining social cohesion. But the challenge we face at the end of the day is not only deciding what it is that we want, but how it is that we should get what we want from corporations, and what levers do we actually have to adjust corporate behavior going forward? Well, there are a number of different tools, quite frankly, that are available to us, and people often overlook this, taking the approach that what can we possibly do against powerful corporations? I'm just one small consumer. But I would remind you that there are a number of social tools that we can use to bear against corporations who may be behaving badly or in ways that we find are problematic for society at large. We have the government. We have direct labor actions. We have community actions. We have personal choices like boycotting. We have financial choices like choosing to divest from certain kinds of industries, which are ultimately harming society. It's important for people to remember that even though we don't necessarily have a specific set of tools for what we think is the best approach, right, we do have to recognize that profit for corporations doesn't happen without the participating consent of society. And that means that all members of society have some ability to bring pressure against corporations and how it is that they choose to make their decisions. This is not to say that we should all arm up ourselves with torches and pitchforks to walk down to our local grocery store and demand lower prices, but it is important to recognize that businesses fundamentally serve society and they work within society. And that means that we have a lot of power to change the behaviors of even the largest firms. We just really have to decide what to do with it. And so what we're left with in the modern world is a lot of different tools that people are attempting to use to shape the behaviors of firms. We look towards things like corporate social responsibility. We've tried to create systems of ESG ratings. We've tried to provide better oversight of supply chains to improve things like employment practices around the world. We've tried to reduce climate impacts in order to make society more survivable for everyone at large, as opposed to simply focusing on those who are buying the products. But exactly what goals we should want firms to pursue is simply not clear to us. And how we establish this is going to be important for us over the next few decades, because firms have reached the size and scale of impact that they can now affect global climate. This is no longer a matter of simply a few monopolists making money off of coal exports along the Tyne River. We're now talking about global problems that affect the whole of society. And so we're going to have to think very carefully over the next few decades about how it is that we are going to constrain some of the worst behaviors of corporations and encourage some of the best. And that's where I want to leave things off for today. Hopefully it's been a bit interesting for you to consider this idea of a trade-off between corporations and society, that society and companies effectively are working together for mutual gains, but of course that we have to think carefully about the relationship between them. What is society getting for the benefits we are providing to corporations? And of course, what is society providing for corporations? If we hope to maintain an alignment of interests, then strictly speaking, we need to identify what the interests of both corporations and society are. And that is where I want to leave things with you today, is the need for us to define exactly what it is that we are hoping for so that we can begin to think about the best tools for accomplishing those goals.
Excellent. Thank you, Will. And I am impressed. That was just over 20 minutes. You did an amazing job. At this point, I'm happy when we hosted these guest lectures in the past, happy to answer any questions that you might have for Will. And then if there is time, I do have a couple of slides just to talk about our program. So you are welcome to either pose your question in the chat, or you can unmute and ask the question. So we'll just keep an eye on the chat for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got it open here. So
okay. Lots of thank yous. Great.
In the meantime, while thank yous are rolling in, it's quite possible that people are trying to think about questions to ask. So I'll give you guys a bit of a teaser in the short term. If you're interested in exploring these kinds of topics further, I do teach an elective that explores how and why certain developments occurred in the history of our modern financial kit. And this is all taught in the History of Finance course. Each week in that course, we examine a different kind of financial organization or technology and consider its use and its development from ancient times through to the modern day and how it's affected those who use it. So interestingly enough, in January, the course will be running, and the style of learning, just to give you some idea of what to expect in the upper years of the program, involves students basically watching videos and reading notes ahead of class, and then spending most of our class time discussing in a seminar style presentations about what different types of organizations and technologies we've seen created using these particular tools. We want to think about things like how to improve payment architectures, how to build better pensions that can resist demographic inversions. So usually the learning in that sort of course doesn't involve a lot of memorization or calculation, strictly speaking, but it does involve a lot of ideation and collaboration between students who are working on case studies, try to understand different important turning points in financial history. For instance, this year we'll be talking about a case that occurred in mid-20th century in Canada, the coin affair. In 1961, where the governor of the Bank of Canada openly feuded with the federal government about what policy ought to be regarding interest rates and spending. So maybe I'll see you there in a couple of years, but it gives you some idea about what sorts of questions and bigger things that we like to consider at the graduate level.
Excellent. Thank you, Will. And I will let you, there's a couple of questions in the chat for you.
I see them coming in.
Okay.
Talika said, thanks very much for such a great presentation. I vote from a CSR background and have a keen interest in building a career in this field. My major concern is about the corporations which are using greenwashing for their brand building. How should we tackle this issue? I would argue that the best solution for greenwashing is twofold. One, don't wait around to believe what a corporation tells you they're doing. That's like asking a kid if they cleaned their room and the kid says yes. Of course they're going to say that they cleaned their room. The real question is whether or not they did. So what we really require is verification. And that is a lot easier in the modern world. In the 20th century, it was very easy for corporations to pretend to be good corporate citizens. But in the 21st century, between things like commercial satellite imagery and social media, it's very hard for corporations to hide what it is that they're up to. And so I think that ultimately, if we want to undermine efforts at corporate greenwashing, one of the things that's going to be required is more active participation in governance. And nobody likes to hear that, because everybody wants a lazy free ride. Everybody would love it if somebody else got out there and solved the world's problems for them. But the truth is that things aren't going to happen unless we police them ourselves. So if we're concerned about companies that are faking it, we need to take our own personal actions against this, whether this is boycotting them, whether this is blocking any sort of investment capital from getting to them, whether this is harassing them on social media, asking governments to take actions. These are the kinds of things that we need to do. There needs to be some personal action, in my opinion. I think that part of the biggest problem is that we are waiting for someone else to solve the problem because we don't personally know what to do. And I think that that has been a major problem throughout the 20th century. If we take a look at how people dealt with environmental issues, they simply said, I don't know what I can do. It's too much for me to do. And the real answer is do a little bit. If everybody does a little bit, even something, it's better than nothing. And we don't need an instant utopian solution. What we need is incremental improvement towards a better world. So my argument, Talika, would be that we need more personal engagement in this matter. Arslan said, do you believe the impact of investor behavior on the working of a corporation matters a lot? Yes. Yes, at the end of the day, our The major issue is not that investors don't care. It's that investors pool their capital and then ask a manager to rule in their interest effectively. If we think about the difference between, say, a blacksmith 2,000 years ago and their customers, and what we deal with today when I try to, say, buy an automobile from Ford, the difference is the blacksmith 2,000 years ago made the product themselves, certified the product themselves, and was directly responsible for the product. Today, what we have is a sales manager at a auto lot that's going to sell things to me, who did not produce the goods. The goods were produced at a factory by a manager who did not actually produce the goods themselves. The factory was overseen by managers working for directors who are ultimately elected usually by shareholders. And so what we have are the interests of potentially millions of shareholders in loud conflict with each other about what it is that the firm ought to be doing. And this makes it a lot harder for individual investors to be heard amid the din of other investors. The biggest problem at the end of the day is scale. And so I really do believe that investor attitudes matter, and that if you really don't like a particular company or their way of doing business, don't buy their debt, don't buy their shares, don't buy their products. So yeah, individual investors and individual consumers have the power to make the needle move. Quite frankly, there is almost nothing else we can do to businesses. And as a result, I always encourage people to vote with their dollars and let businesses know when you are unhappy with their behavior, because there's very little that changes their behavior quite as much as people shifting away their purchasing. And Andy asks, I have a question. What role do you think blended financing or catalytic financing can play in ensuring corporates can do their bit towards CSR or ESG? Catalytic financing basically boils down to financiers, I believe, putting conditions on whether or not they will finance particular business. And so I think that's quite valuable. It does a lot of the same sort of role as an individual consumer deciding that they will or won't support certain kinds of businesses. So if we're looking at early stage financing, it's quite possible to supply resources to firms that we believe are going to make a difference, what we would otherwise call impact investing, while at the same time, it's quite possible for us to starve startups that we think are going to be problematic. Now, in terms of how successful we've been at CSR and ESG in the modern world, I would argue, unfortunately, that while we have very strong intentions in mind, the tools we currently use for ESG are quite poor, unfortunately. For instance, a lot of our ESG rankings rank tech companies very, very highly, because tech companies tend to not engage in as much, primary manufacturing for their goods. And as a result, they appear to be very clean tech companies. And the problem is that this has shifted investment largely into tech, right in time for a tech bubble to burst, but it has channeled a ton of money into tech, neglecting to channel money towards other necessary industries that we need to evolve, right? If we necessarily need to improve how it is that we produce fruit, then divesting from fruit or failing to invest in fruit isn't going to supply the capital necessary to transform those businesses. What would be necessary is things like impact investing, I think. Things where we are specifically focused on providing financing to firms that will make a demonstrable difference. I think it's more important for us to pursue doing good than to simply avoid doing evil. People have pretended that they are good or are meritorious simply because they have said, I'm not a sinner. But I think that's sort of ridiculous, quite frankly. The idea that I am a saint because I have not sinned is a false dichotomy. Corporations are not necessarily doing good simply because they fail to do evil. And so I think it's important for us to put a little bit of pressure on actually doing good as opposed to just not doing bad. Mohammed asked, what is your opinion about the effects of blockchain technology on corporations? Blockchain is a complicated piece of technology. I think that ultimately it's particularly clever for record-keeping systems. We do spend a bunch of time in the history of finance class talking about blockchains, mostly because it is an updated version of writing. It's the ledger system all over again from 3000 BC, except it's a little bit harder to commit fraud, a little bit. Ultimately, though, I don't think blockchain technology is going to revolutionize business or revolutionize finance in the way that many of its touters would have us believe. A lot of those people are P.T. Barnum. They will also tell you they can sell you tickets to see the mermaid. So Yes, there is some value in blockchain technology, but it is not nearly, how do we say, ready for proper commercial rollout in many areas. Now, that said, there are certain blockchain applications we've been using for a long time. For instance, when you log into the CRA, if you log into Canada Revenue Agency using a partner login, it uses a tool called Secure Key. Secure Key runs off blockchains. So there are lots of applications, but I would not say that it's that cryptocurrency is necessarily the best application of blockchains.
Hi, can I ask a follow-up on something you said earlier?
Sure.
Thank you. So you're talking about boycotting and the power of your dollar and voting with the dollar. Just curious how strong you think those methods to holding corporations socially responsible are. Maybe when there's like a layer of removal from actually seeing the results of their business practices, maybe like with climate change, where it might not be readily in front of our eyes, and also maybe with like outsourcing labor. We don't see that firsthand here in the US or Canada. So you might not feel as strongly about it. And then also maybe with a fear of missing out or being left behind. If I don't invest in this company, the next guy will. So it's still going to happen. Now I'm going to be poorer than they are. So I'm going to do it anyway.
There's an important consideration. And just from a moral point of view, the idea that somebody got richer than me and that's a problem, it's totally not true. This idea of keeping up with the Joneses is dumb. FOMO in investing is going to lead to all kinds of stupid decisions. For example, take a look at all of the people that piled into crypto, or GameStop for that matter, simply because everybody else was. People who bought houses in the last year simply because everybody else was and they thought that they were going to miss their chance are now really getting sort of punished for trying to, how do I say, harvest some free wealth. So to your other point, though, about our inability to monitor, I think the key thing is going to be that investors who want to make a difference and want to be able to put pressure on companies need information about who's doing what. And simply, it's almost impossible for us to know who's ultimately driving a lot of these problems, but that information is available. The problem is most investors, most consumers aren't interested in learning about that. In some cases, what we see are companies that have hidden their ownership through layers of foreign subsidiaries, which can make it hard for us to necessarily boycott a parent company who does most of their nefarious deeds effectively through a subsidiary. There's an interesting thing happening right now, actually. There's a lawsuit that in Canada that may change things substantially. There's an interesting problem with limited liability that is referred to by corporate lawyers as piercing the corporate veil, which basically means if I set up a subsidiary in another country that is capitalized and something goes wrong in that country, you can't sue the parent. You can only sue the local subsidiary. And the ability to sue the parent company for the behavior of its subsidiary is what we refer to as piercing the corporate veil. I have not discovered in several years of looking any instance where this has taken place. Which means, of course, that companies can simply set up subsidiaries and then behave badly. This is what happened with the Union Carbide accident in Bhopal in 1984. The reason the payouts were so low to people is because the Indian sub was improperly capitalized. And they got as much money as they could out of the subsidiary, but Union Carbide in America suffered no losses as a result of bad corporate behavior of Union Carbide India. So being able to track down who the ultimate owners of a corporation can be tricky, but there are some pretty good software solutions out there, mostly since large public companies are all registered with the with securities regulators. And therefore, it sometimes takes a little bit of effort to figure out who the beneficial owners are, but you'll be happy to learn that there are certain pieces of software which can enable that. There was a piece of software, there was an app about 5 years ago called Boycott, which allowed you to scan barcodes from companies, and it would show you who ultimately created these companies, as well as who the beneficial owners of these firms were. So if you decided you didn't like Rupert Murdoch, for instance, you could very quickly identify what companies were owned or controlled by the Murdochs and simply avoid buying their products. But ultimately that hinges on information. And if investors and members of communities at large simply think that it's too much trouble to get that information, then firms are going to, well, just like the East India Company, or like the Aber Congo Company or the Hudson Bay Company, simply operate over the horizon and do whatever they want. So it's sort of on us. We have to take steps to try to police them. And hoping that somebody else does it usually doesn't work.
Will we have time for one? Sorry, Thomas, go ahead.
I was just going to say thank you for the response.
Thanks, Thomas. Will we have time for one more question in the chat? And then there's one question I do want to ask you that they may be
absolutely
afraid to ask you.
I've got 4 questions left in the chat, so I'll try to give those like fast responses to them. Socialism or Democrats, which one do you think is more viable results in our society? Those 2 things are not in conflict. So I don't think this is an either or choice. Bad question, I guess. Arslan asked, do you think minor scale corporations face more legal restrictions as compared to larger ones due to their immense team? No, I think that larger ones are under a lot more scrutiny than necessarily smaller ones. I'm not saying that the regulatory burden is appropriate or is necessarily balanced properly, but I don't think that small businesses endure more regulations than large businesses. I don't think that's necessarily true. Rahul asked, what are your thoughts on modern day technology companies that are almost untouchable due to them providing essential services? Technology is not essential. I had a really good life before the internet existed. I'm not afraid of losing the internet. It would make my job harder, no question. But the idea that I need a smartphone, no. No, the idea that I need Zoom or need Facebook or need to, pay by tapping my phone, none of that is true. Life worked just fine in 1994. It's not saying that there aren't cool things that we now have in the future, but to try to pretend that like my Google mapping service is essential, so I have to give them all my data, this is a bad mistake. This is us misreading the map and pretending that things we want are things we need, and therefore that we're at the service of corporations.